Hey, Ross here. Just a quick note before we start the episode. I wanted to let you know about a chance to meet me and other like-minded urbanists at the Green Urbanist online meetup on 3rd of October at 6 p.m. UK time. This will be an informal chat over video call for listeners of the podcast, so I can get to know you a little bit better and you can ask questions or share your ideas with me. If that sounds fun, register using the link at the bottom of this episode description. Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Hello. We're back again with another episode. This time it's a conversation with Nadina Galle.
So my name is Nadina Galle. I'm a Dutch-Canadian ecological engineer, which essentially means that I work at this intersection of nature, people, and surprisingly technology, and how those three things can actually fit together to build better cities.
The topic of our chat today is Nadina's beautifully written new book, The Nature of Our Cities, Harnessing the Power of the Natural World to Survive a Changing Planet. We talk about the importance of urban nature, in particular for climate adaptation, but also our health and childhood development and things like that. And then we get into this conversation of what Nadina calls the Internet of Nature, which is these emerging technologies that are now helping practitioners in cities to really improve the management and the survival of urban nature. Things like trees, urban forests. We also talk about which cities are leading the way in this technological approach to managing urban nature. Some really interesting case studies from places like Amsterdam and Boston and New York. And then at the end, we also talk about the potential risks of becoming overly reliant on technology and how we might be able to avoid that. As well as being packed full of interesting information, Nadina is also a fantastic storyteller, and her book is really structured in a series of stories. It's very narrative driven, and she pulls out some of her favourite stories from the book to tell us on the podcast. And it just makes for really nice listening. So enjoy this episode. Let me know what you think. Links to the book and to Nadina's podcast, the Internet of Nature podcast, are in the episode description. And if you need even more after that, Nadina was actually previously a guest on the Green Urbanist podcast way back in episode 27, where she does a bit more introduction on what is the Internet of Nature, how she coined that term, the research she's done around that, etc. So that's a really nice episode as well. All right, for now, enjoy the episode. If you enjoy this episode, do please share it with a colleague or a friend, or share it on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever. Really, really helps to just spread the word for the podcast and these really important topics. Cool. Thanks very much. Also, just listening back to the recording, I must have had a cold or a stuffy nose or something the day where we're recording, because my voice sounds really weird and nasally. Sorry about that. It is actually me on the recording, not my evil twin. Luckily now my voice is back to normal. So let's maybe get into your book, The Nature of Cities. What motivated you to write it? And maybe just tell us a bit about the premise as well.
Yeah. So The Nature of Our Cities came about, there's the long version of the story and the very short version of the story. The shorter, medium version, let's go with that, is that I had always wanted to write. As I was briefly telling you before, I had applied to journalism school coming out of high school, was waitlisted, and absolutely bummed that I didn't get in and rapidly needed a plan B. And that was going to study my other big love, which was the outdoors, which I learned was called ecology at university. So I studied that. That kind of, spiraled into a 10-year academic career, which accumulated in a PhD in ecological engineering. And in that PhD, I coined this idea of the Internet of Nature, this subclassification of emerging technologies that we can actually use to better map, monitor, manage urban nature, and I would say most importantly, actually connect urbanites to the nature that surrounds them. And when I finished that PhD, I had a great time. I love academia. I love, just getting to ask questions and attempt to find answers all day. But one of the things that I think a lot of academics stumble across is feeling like a lot of that knowledge was kept in the so-called ivory tower. And as I was doing this PhD research, I came across so many exciting ideas and mostly people that were really at the heart of this Internet of Nature movement. So I started a podcast, which was very much a pandemic project in 2021, the Internet of Nature podcast, as a first initial medium to try and bring some of those stories more to the mainstream. And as I was having more of these conversations now in a more, formalized media output, I was like, well, there's even more here. And that's when I really realized there was more, perhaps more than enough for a book. And I started just writing, just stories. I would collect stories of both people that I was interviewing, but also stories from my own personal life, me dealing with heat waves that we were facing in Amsterdam, my experience with flooding, my own kind of journey through reconnecting with nature in these really, heavy periods of mental health distress during the pandemic, for example. My own kind of, as a new mother, kind of coming to terms with, well, how do you raise, a wild, feral, nature-loving child in this age of modern cities and screens and technology? So a lot of personal journey, and also, coupled with these interviews and interesting conversations I was having with people, I just started to write, and that ultimately led to a proposal and then ultimately a book deal with HarperCollins in the US. And I'm very, very proud of that, because it meant for the first time that this conversation of urban ecology and the importance of nature in our cities was hitting some version of the mainstream. And that's, I'd say, the thing that I'm probably most proud of still to this day.
Yeah, no, well done. I mean, I've started reading the book. I'm like a notoriously slow reader, so I think I'm only on chapter 3 or something, but it's...
There's also an audiobook.
Is there? Yeah, that might help me to speed up what I'm doing. But it is really well written. And I would say to people, like, there's so many non-fiction books out there, and there's a lot of different approaches, I guess, to writing these things. But like, I love that you take a really narrative and quite journalistic approach, and it feels quite personal. It feels like short stories each chapter, but within it is just so much information and very research backed and scientific. But you're telling it through almost your life stories, which just makes it actually just really enjoyable. So yeah, definitely one to pick up for people. But while you're here, let's get a sense of what's in it, and you can tell us some of the stories that are in it. I think what you do in each of the chapters is you sort of you almost sort of highlight people who are working within this field of urban ecology and the Internet of Nature. What were some of your favourite stories that you got to tell in that book?
Oh, that's a good question. There are so many. I think one of the chapters that has really, really stayed with me long after I experienced it and long after I wrote it. And quick side note to say, Ross, that I really appreciate you pulling out the fact that it is so narrative driven, because that is precisely what I really hope to do. I really have it be very dialogue rich, almost like one of the best compliments I've gotten so far is like, it's written like a novel, but it's all true. And like, yeah, no, that was really the idea, because I think dialogue has this way of really pulling the reader in. And it got to the point where I was just in the throes of doing all this writing that I started to narrate my own life, because you start to see everything through this lens of being able to write it in dialogue. And it was like, oh, there sat a woman with a slightly lavender sweater perched on the side of a bench. She said this to her neighbor, and you start to narrate everything that you see around you. So it kind of brings this added perspective to life.
Funny.
But on that note, one of my favorite stories that I write about in the book is getting invited to climb a 130-foot Douglas fir tree in Eugene, in Oregon, with Scott Altenhoff. He used to be Eugene's head urban forester, and about 2 years ago, he got promoted to a really unique position, which is actually the head of urban and community forestry for the entire state of Oregon. So a really unique position that actually a lot of states don't have. So it just kind of shows Oregon's commitment to urban forestry and urban ecology. And And it was so magical because it just lended so well also to having it be a story in the book, because here I am speaking to this man with such a wealth of knowledge, having built up his career from a tree climber, a tree surgeon, a tree carer, to head urban forester, to now head of urban forestry for the state. And as we're climbing this Douglas fir, which, I hadn't climbed a tree since I was 8 years old and fallen out of it. So that in itself was already an experience. And getting to talk with him about, what do urban trees mean for people living in cities, and specifically with this lens of mental health and longevity. And it was so special because it was that morning, actually, that I learned that I was pregnant. Mm-hmm. And as we're climbing up this tree, he is talking about how important specifically it is to have trees for the youngest generations, and also drawing these beautiful parallels between that every tree starts as this, this seed underneath the ground. It's only through our care and our nurture that we create these beings that then hopefully stay in our cities long after that we're gone. And there was all these beautiful parallels as I'm climbing this tree and slamming my body against the trunk because I don't know what I'm doing, and at the same time processing this news that I'm pregnant. But of course Scott doesn't know this, and he's talking these beautiful parallels about children and trees in our cities. And that interview I will never ever forget. And it was so beautiful when 6 months later I called him up to do a little bit of fact checking, as you do for these interviews. And I was like, well, actually, Scott, there is some news that I want to share with you that I couldn't quite share yet because nobody else knew at that time. And that was it was a beautiful full circle moment. So that's definitely stayed with me.
That's amazing. Wow. What was the view like from the top?
It was insane. It was absolutely insane. You had this completely 360-degree view of Eugene. You saw like kids that looked, smaller than ants playing soccer. It's actually, it gave me a whole new appreciation of tree care and tree surgery, and the folks that are climbing trees on a daily basis to keep us safe and keep the trees safe. Really quite magical.
Yeah, I have so much respect for all the arboriculturalists and ecologists that are sort of really don't get the recognition that they deserve. They're often working quietly in the background with this enormous pool of knowledge, and doing this really important work with often with little funding and that kind of thing. So I think that's probably quite a good, that's a good part of the book as well, is really for bringing to the foreground these people who are often not in the limelight, but really should be.
Definitely. No, they're not the people that are going to be the keynote speaker at the conference, or that are going to be featured in documentaries, or even, guests on a podcast. So that, I think, has been indeed what you say, Ross, is like that has been really special to bring their stories to the forefront. And also this greater realization that this work is often in the minute details. Like, I think it's easy kind of in this conversation around green urbanism to stay very high level and to stay very, strategy based and vision based. I'm not saying that doesn't have a place, but when you ultimately get down to it, it is the, arboriculturists, the urban foresters, the urban ecologists that are taking soil samples that really are doing the micro level work that is very necessary in bringing nature, in our cities to the fore. So that has been very eye-opening as well.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely come back to some of that more like nitty-gritty technical stuff, because that is really interesting. I want to come back firstly to this question of why is nature in cities so important for the younger generation? And can you tell us about some of the science behind that?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, as a new mom, I can say I've now experienced it firsthand. My little guy is now 15 months old. And, if we're still inside the house after an hour that he's woken up for the day, we're getting antsy. Like, I think that's something that a lot of parents can relate to. Just kids just have this rain or shine intrinsic want, but I would say need to be outside and to be in the fresh air, and I think we often talk about children as these, representatives of what we're really like what adults are really like, right? They say anything, they have no filter, they make they don't mask any of their needs or desires, right? They just say what they want and they get it, I think that has really been clear. We now live in a society where it's very normal that we spend 95% of our lives indoors. And I think it's through our littlest ones that we can see just how unnatural that is.
Yeah.
And that being, there's so many ways to approach this topic, but some of the research specifically with children in connection to nature is, I drew, and I have a long drawn out interview also with Richard Louv in the book, in the very last chapter called Raising Future Naturalists. For those that aren't familiar, Richard Louv is now on his 11th book. He's this really well-established journalist based in California, and he has written extensively about this idea of nature deficit disorder, which at the time when his book, Last Child in the Woods, came out, that really coined and introduced this topic, he was really nervous to do so because, medical professionals can look down on those and have a lot of controversy with those who try to maybe establish new medical terms without there necessarily being the evidence for it. Yeah. And I think now, 20 years on, there is so much research that has come out. And I think he is incredibly modest. He would never say that he played a role in that, but so I'll say it for him. He really catapulted this idea that children need to be in nature. And as I was saying, there's this innate need to be in nature. And all of this research has come out that says that, if you have greener schoolyards, there is less conflict on the schoolyard during recess periods. If children, are sit down and taken a test, if they do that right away, coming from a different classroom, they score a certain amount. If they first spend 15 minutes in a forested environment, they score X amount of points better because the concentration and the cognitive development is better. There's this research, this nature deficit disorder, to show that there are symptoms, much like those that we see in ADHD children, that children have less impulse control, less cognitive development, less focus, more irritable, more easily. There's research to show that they have less temper tantrums when they're outside in nature, right? I think all of that comes down to is, I think in the medical world surrounding nature research, we're really quick to want to reduce it, right? So we look at nature and we're like, well, being outside in nature is better because we have increased vitamin D. It's better for our eyesight. It's better for our concentration, right? We want to reduce it down to all these little benefits. But I think we should flip that whole discussion on its head and say, what is it exactly that we're losing when we spend all of that time indoors? And ultimately, I think it comes to this fact is we are doing something that is completely unnatural. It's especially evident in children, but ultimately I think all of those lessons can relate back to adults as well.
Absolutely. So well said. And I think there's sometimes a danger when we look at these academic studies that look at things like, the benefits of walking in the park or the benefits of having 30 minutes outdoors, that we almost think that's the metric to aim for then, whereas actually that's almost like a minimum dose, and anything more than that is much more beneficial. So I think really I don't know. I don't know the research on this, but I presume there's no upper limit for the benefits of being out in nature. It's not like 2 hours, beyond 2 hours, you're not going to get anything else. It feels like the more time in natural settings, the better it will be for you. As long as you're not,
absolutely
in lashing rain or snowstorm or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. As long as you're somewhat safe from the natural elements, I would say there is no limit.
Cool. Let's bring the conversation around to talking a little bit more about where technology comes into this, because I think that's something that is often missing from the discussion of nature in cities or urban greening. And that's your particular angle on this, which I think is really interesting. What sort of, I suppose, moment from the book or story would you pull out that sort of illustrates the purpose and the benefits of sort of bringing technology into this sort of urban nature conversation?
Yeah, I think, this sounds so cliche, but to start with something as simple as, you can't manage what you don't measure. So to bring a little bit of context to that is urban forestry and urban ecology, I think much like the arts, for example, has long been structurally underfunded in city governments. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's been very difficult for urban foresters to explain why exactly their work is so powerful and so important, right? Because if you look at the balance sheet of urban forestry, you have all of these costs, right? Having a healthy urban forest is expensive, right? It costs money, but that's not to say you don't get, 100 times X those returns on that investment, but that return on investment can be really difficult to quantify. And even if you've quantified it, it can be really difficult to communicate. And especially when you need to do that to investors, stakeholders, people that you need money from to be able to fund these things. And I think that's where technology is playing an increasingly important role. Number one, so that we can actually have really good tree inventories. So for those that aren't familiar, a tree inventory can be a really simple database, which essentially just shows the locations of all of the trees that are owned by the city. Ideally, you have them for all of the trees in cities, both on private land and on public land, showing their location, their condition, their species, their age, and any other information that might be relevant about that tree. You would be surprised at how many cities, especially in American and Canadian cities, don't have a tree inventory or don't have a working tree inventory, meaning like, oh yeah, we did that about 15 years ago, but yeah, that data is so out of date, we can't use that anymore. I experienced this firsthand while I was living in Boston for the latter part of my PhD research and got the opportunity to meet the urban forestry team in Boston. And for my PhD research, I was taking soil samples from specifically red maple trees. And I went to the chief urban forester thinking, he could tell me the location of red maple trees because, he manages 300,000 trees in the city of Boston. So I go to his office and I write about this story in the book. And, his office is, it's this low ceiling, he's got these like fluorescent light tubes. It's like this little building tucked away from this park, really, really far away from the city hall of Boston itself. And that in itself, I think already sketches the idea of what I'm talking about, that urban forestry is just not taken seriously. And I'm there and, I'm in his office, he's got stacks of paper, he's got Post-its all over, he's got scribbles all over his hands. And I'm like, hi, I'm Nadina. I'm here, I'm a PhD student at MIT. Like, can you help me? And he's like, okay, here we go. And he's like, well, sorry to inform you, but we actually do not have a tree inventory for the city of Boston. Luckily, 5 years on, that's now changed and they now do have one. They've invested in one. But at that time in 2019, they didn't. And he's like, but, I'll tell you what, for the next 2 weeks, as I'm driving around doing my things, I will note down the locations of red maple trees, their addresses. And indeed, 2 weeks later, he sent me an email with a list of red maple trees and their addresses. I stupidly am asking him a question. I was like, you can identify a red maple tree from your car? And meanwhile, this man has been working the urban forest in Boston for many, many years. Yes, he can identify a red maple tree from a car. So it was a big, big learning curve for me. But it just goes to show, there's one man, the manager of the urban forest, with a very small team managing what I would argue is one of the most important infrastructural assets that we have in our cities. And I think for too long, the urban forest has been seen as, the costs and benefits are with the Department of Parks and Recreation, when really the benefits of the urban forest, they're impacting the economy, public health, climate, sustainability, emissions, the arts, you could say, because they provide a venue for those activities to take place. Department of Education, again, they provide a venue for children to learn. You could make arguments that the urban forest impacts every single other department of the city, yet the Parks and Recreation Department has to deal with all of the costs. So technology, our initial question here, can play a really important role because it's providing the software to do these tree inventories better. It's providing tools like LiDAR, this method to actually do a 3D scan of your environment, create this digital twin of your trees so that we don't need armies of people in cash-strapped, departments to be able to measure and go out and measure all these trees manually. We actually have now new scanning methodologies that can actually help with that, so that we can really target and optimize their limited time to go to the trees that really need them. And then we have all of these incredible modeling tools that can actually show us the benefits and actually quantify that in dollar, euro, pound amounts, so that we actually know exactly what those trees are offering. So that's just one way that I think technology is completely revolutionizing this field, so that ultimately we can start to see the urban forest for the incredibly valuable resource that it is. Because right now in 2024, that's still not being done, in my opinion.
Yeah, totally. It's a common thing, I think, across a lot of biodiversity and climate action, is the compartmentalization and a lack of understanding of how interconnected it is with so many other things. I mean, I think the healthcare aspect of it is incredible as well. Is that actually, £1,000 invested in urban greening saves X many £1,000 20 years later in healthcare costs. There's lots of things like this which is really well established within research. But it's that thing of sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you would be surprised how many sustainability climate action plans cities have with no mention of trees, no mention of parks, no mention of natural spaces. It's completely geared towards reducing emissions, reducing cars, installing solar panels. I'm like, hello, we have the world's best quote-unquote climate solution right here in front of us. A little conversation between these departments, I think, could go a long way. And I write about this in the epilogue of the book. The book is kind of unique that it has a very fiction-like prologue and epilogue to bookmark the book. And in the epilogue, I write about, having this, basically the prologue is a city without nature, epilogue is a city with nature. And in that epilogue, I theorize, philosophize about this city department where, parks and recreation is really in the center of all of the decision making that, have all of these different departments deal with, right? Healthcare, public health is dealing with pollution issues, physical activity issues, mental health issues, diabetes, chronic illnesses, all of these things where research shows us that the urban forest can help. The Department of Education is dealing with, the future of learning for our youngest ones. The urban forest can help. Climate is dealing with emissions reduction and creating a more sustainable city. The urban forest can help. It's so central to all of our decision making. We need to foster more conversations between those two departments.
Yeah. Just for people who may be unfamiliar with the terminology, when you say urban forest, that's the totality of all the trees in a city. Is that right?
Exactly. So it's not just the street trees. It's not just the cities that are the trees that are managed by the city. It's every single tree that you can find in a city, whether it's a park or a backyard, a front yard, or on a street.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So I'll ask a really fundamental question that can then maybe tee us up to talk a bit more about like maintenance and management. If you go to, a woodland or a forest, a natural forest, the trees there just exist. They don't need maintenance necessarily from humans. Why is it that the urban forest or urban nature needs a lot more sort of human involvement to thrive?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and not one I'm asked often, actually. There's so many different reasons for it. I would say first and foremost is that, at times it feels like we're trying to make the impossible possible. We are planting, and that's why it's so important to plant, as they say in arboriculture, the right tree at the right time in the right place, because you really want to ensure that before you even think about planting a tree, the growing conditions and the place where you're going to put that tree is conducive to the tree being there, not just for a couple of years and then have to be removed and replaced, but hopefully for generations. And so that's first and foremost, is that, we are trying to bring the natural environment into areas that can be very unnatural. And that in itself requires just more strategic thinking about what can sometimes feel artificial but necessary. Like there's something called the Stockholm method, which is actually where you're putting plastic crates underneath the ground to actually reserve that space for the future root growth. And these things, it seems kind of artificial, but it's actually really necessary, because if you don't as a tree reserve the space you're going to need in the future, that space is going to be encroached by other things, whether that be cables or sewer pipelines or roadworks or whatever it might be. It's really important that that space is reserved. So that's one. The other, of course, is to keep us humans safe, right? There is such thing as dendrophobia, this fear of trees. And for some people, that's a very rightful fear. Perhaps they've had a branch fall on them, or their car, or their property. Perhaps they've seen what it's like to have a tree topple over in a bad storm. Some people have experienced what it's like when roots grow into their sewer pipes and they're forced to move because of that, right? There's a certain conflict between people and trees in cities, because we're sharing very dense spaces with each other. So there are ways, whether that's through pruning when absolutely necessary to keep the tree safe, whether that's with supports. And this is really where, as we were saying before, Ross, the skill sets of really highly experienced arboriculturists comes into play. They are experts. Arboriculturists are experts in the health and condition of individual trees. Urban foresters look at the health of the overall urban forest. That's really where their expertise comes into play. So that, I would say, are the two main reasons: making sure that these living beings can survive in our very unnatural systems, and making sure that that space is reserved, they're taken good care of. And on the other hand, making sure that they're kept safe, that we're kept safe, and also trees for that matter. So it's really the safety of both. And one of the ways that technology is playing an interesting role in this is, I talk about the city of Singapore, which has something like 7 million trees. Mind you, it's also a completely different climate, a subtropical humid climate where, growth is insane. Things grow incredibly quickly, like nothing we can imagine, in London versus Amsterdam or anywhere else here in the Northern Hemisphere. And one of the ways that they're really leading the charge is, not only have they established this digital twin of their urban forest that is continuously updated, but they also have this whole network of sensors that they use to measure things like sap flow, really a proxy for how quickly that tree is growing. They also have tilt sensors, which basically give an idea of the structural integrity of that tree. They use things like soil sensors and other soil life sensors to make sure that the soil is in good shape. So they really have this whole network of, I'm not saying it's a replacement for human ingenuity and human checks. Actually, that's a big liability question that we could get into. But it is a way to provide your urban forestry team, because you're managing, in Singapore, millions of trees, give you a little bit of guidance of, okay, you open up your computer for the day, where should my focuses be targeted that day?
So using things like soil sensors, you can basically get almost like a live dashboard, in a sense, of where trees might need attention.
Exactly, and these kinds of technologies have been super commonplace when it comes to things like flooding infrastructure, drains, structural integrity of buildings, of bridges, of roads. We've been using these technologies for years and years and years, but it's only now that we're beginning to see them in the urban ecology space.
Are they expensive to do these things? Like, what are the sort of barriers of entry?
It's a good question. Soil moisture sensors in general are not very expensive. Sap flow sensors are much more expensive. Tilt sensors can also be more expensive. So in every decision that you're making, you of course have to look at, okay, what is the initial investment and how much am I getting out of this? And for every city, that's going to look very different. For soil moisture sensors, there's a really good economic case to be made, because the majority of contractors that are subcontracted by the city to plant and maintain trees are responsible for that tree's life somewhere between 2 to 5 years. So if the tree dies within that period, they are financially obligated to replace that tree. So it's very much in their interest to install and invest in something like soil moisture sensors, because if that little bit of information is going to give them the right data to make better decisions in terms of when to water the tree, and more importantly, when not to water the tree, kind of an often misconception is that we are structurally watering trees too little, which can definitely be the case in increasingly hot and dry summers. But we've then also kind of overcompensated, and that we give too much water at too much at the wrong time, and we actually see things like tree rot, which can then also root rot, which can also then cause the death of the tree. So getting the right amount of water at the right time has actually been proven to have your tree grow 3 times faster, and the faster it grows, the more self-sufficient it can be, the more independent it can be, the faster you can remove that soil sensor and place it somewhere else. So I think there's a really good economic case to be made there. I also think there's a fantastic economic case to be made for creating, using LiDAR technology, this 3D digital twin of your urban forest. And then I think using these other sensors that are more expensive sparingly in areas that you've now identified with your 3D digital twin. Where are trees that are going to be in more danger? Where are some high-risk trees that are, for example, in high-density areas, trees in public squares, for example, that might need additional attention? You can kind of make really optimized decisions there.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I sort of have personal experience of this in my local neighborhood. A couple of years ago, to their credit, our local authority here, where I'm living in London, rolled out a lot of street public realm improvements and put in a lot of tree pits and sort of planting areas around streets, which looked great when it went in. But you can sort of predict where I'm going with this, is that in a lot of cases, they were just trees put in really, really tiny boxes, essentially, where they just wouldn't have the root space to really spread and thrive. And also just having like such little soil means it dries out really quickly. And so a couple of hot summers and quite a lot of those trees are dead. So there's a certain amount of magical thinking, I think, that goes into these sort of landscape design and public realm plans, where they think, oh yeah, we can squeeze in 7 trees here. And you're like, but where, is this tree actually going to thrive? It'll look great the day you plant it. You can take the photos, and it looks amazing. Yeah. But, what's happened on my street is they planted 6 trees. I think 3 of them are now dead. And what they also planted, a couple of different plants in the tree pits, one of which was rosemary. And that's the only one that's thriving, because it's a Mediterranean plant. Hot summers, dry soil, it doesn't bother it. It's exploded in growth while everything else is wilting. And it just makes me feel like if you have got limited space, maybe it's not a tree that we need. Maybe it's something else that will just give a little bit of biodiversity benefit, a little bit of a visual benefit. It's still good for your mental health to see greenery, scrubs and flowers. It doesn't have to be a tree. So I think
Precisely.
That's part of the conversation as well, isn't it?
Definitely. And I talk about this too. And I talk about the city of Paris, which about 2 years ago came out with these really big greening ambitions. And what I liked about those is they were also realistic and said, look, there are some, call them streets, more like alleyways in Paris that are so incredibly dense that, planting a tree there, like it's not going to happen. And that's okay. And we need to be realistic in that. But that's not to say that there can't be any greenery. They actually, they called that concept creating oasis streets. So working with different shrubs, different greenery, green walls, these kinds of things, that you can still have a massive impact without it, with it still being realistic. So you don't have problems like this. Because I would say there is that often the role of technology, specifically if we're talking about sensor technologies, it's so much focused on management, right? Making sure that we're monitoring and managing these trees properly. But there's a huge public perception that comes along with that. To kind of tie back into your previous question, how much is this going to cost and what is the investment worth? Sometimes the investment is worth just maintaining the public perception that we can plant greenery in cities and it is going to thrive. Because these kinds of initiatives that you talk about, Ross, those are heartbreaking, right? You go in, full enthusiasm, they plant this beautiful new street, and it you feel the hope, right? The hope is exuding off of these newly planted saplings, only to then have them, shrivel up and die a couple of years later, sometimes months later. That does something, right? There's something really, and I think anyone who's ever done their darndest to try and keep a houseplant alive can relate to this feeling, right? It's this almost, existential disappointment that you feel of, come on, we can't even keep this, thing alive. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, and it's so important, and that in itself is almost worth the investment.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good perspective, actually. What cities would you point people towards as being like the front runners and good examples for this sort of bringing technology into their urban greening?
I hate to be that person that's like, oh, Singapore is so green and so beautiful. But because like, is that not literally the image that we have, of the Marina Bay Sands, which Grant Associates, which, put that together. And, I would say revolutionary architect Andrew Grant, who designed that, did a wonderful job, and it truly is iconic. So not to put down on that at all, because it is a beautiful, beautiful project. I think what can be troublesome about using that as, the iconic image of what a green city has to look like, is that it might not feel very realistic to people. Singapore is really unique in the sense of how its bureaucratic governments work, in how much money it has, and the priority that it's put on urban greening since day one, right? Singapore from day one has been known as a garden in the city. I think they're now even shifting that to a city in the garden, right? They're even shifting that perspective. The amount of money that they've invested in manicuring, their landscapes has been, out of control. But in that sense, they've also, because they've had that financial investment, they have also been front runners in technology, right? They have this digital twin. They use, robotic lawn mowers to help them with landscaping. They have tree climbing robots to help them with pruning. It's really quite something. I got to live there for 6 months during my undergraduate while I was an exchange student there, and it opened up my eyes to a lot of this early thinking. And not only in terms of, how do we, manicure and keep it all incredibly managed, but I would say they're also front runners in having certain landscapes be wild, which is, a whole other kind of part of urban landscaping. So besides Singapore, I would say another really front running city is Amsterdam in many ways. And I think Amsterdam is a really exciting one because there's a lot of historical context that I think specifically a lot of other European cities can relate to. We just talked about Paris. That city was not necessarily designed to have room for trees, which is very different to American and Canadian cities, which have more room, quote unquote, in general, for these kinds of interventions. Amsterdam is really interesting. They've really been front runners at showing how in times of intensive construction projects, you don't need to destroy and decimate your trees. There are actually ways that through the use of sensors and through really smart transplantation efforts, you can actually remove trees from an ecosystem, place them at a nursery temporarily outside the city, do your construction project, and actually place those trees back.
Wow.
And that is something that I think is revolutionary and something that is difficult but quite replicable in cities around the world, because all around the world, cities are dealing with this massive conflict between we need to develop or redevelop this area, but how are we going to do that without losing these trees? And there are really, really interesting ways that Amsterdam is doing that, which I think definitely can be a sign of progress. And I would say in the States or in Canada, I'd say a big front runner is New York City has done some really incredible initiatives in terms of getting volunteers and citizens in general engaged in their urban forest. This started already in 1995 with the first volunteer-led tree census, and that's since grown and grown, coming up on their 4th edition in 2025 next year. Each census every 10 years has taken a huge technological jump, which is exciting, but I think what's the most exciting part about that is that every 10 years has gotten a new demographic, a new group of engaged, citizens and volunteers as they call them, that are engaged in their urban forest. And getting involved in something as almost, it's almost like a tradition, a ritual now of counting your trees with your neighborhood, with your neighbors every 10 years, what that can do. That is really exciting. And the last example that I'll mention is the city of La Paz, not the capital, but the largest city in Bolivia. They have gone above and beyond to get their citizens involved in something called the City Nature Challenge, which is using the iNaturalist app 4 days of the year to identify, document, photograph, and upload as much urban biodiversity as possible. They've gotten almost every single school involved in La Paz in that initiative. And it's such a beautiful celebration of urban nature. It's kind of like urban nature gets its own holiday once a year, these 4 days where the whole community comes out and maps their urban biodiversity. I think it's such a beautiful way, again, using technology as this facilitator, but ultimately, like I say in the book, it's not about technology. Nature first, technology second. Technology is simply a means to facilitate these interactions with the natural world.
Love that. That's great. Really, really. And thanks for, you've almost shared examples from every continent there, which is a great spread.
That was intentional.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's right not to just highlight the sort of Europe and North American big name cities that everyone knows. I'm sure there's so much going on that we places like La Paz that probably most people haven't heard of. So thanks for that. I'm really interested to know maybe the flip side, the dark side of this, of like, when do you think technology goes too far, or when do you think it's just not a good idea, or there might be unintended consequences to this sort of like use of technology in this space?
Yeah, great question. I think I want to answer that from two perspectives. The one being management, and the other kind of being our use of technology as just a regular human being. To start with management, I think the biggest thing that we can run into is trusting the technology too much. This is a really controversial one, because the number one issue, other than, finances and, barriers to entry and those kind of typical things, the number one challenge that ecologists and urban foresters are running into when it comes to adopting these technologies, whether that be a digital twin or a sensor or a new mapping software or what it might be, is that certain people within departments have a really difficult time trusting the technology. So that's a huge hurdle to overcome. But once you've overcome that hurdle, I think then there's also that, in the same way we might be able to relate to when you trust Google Maps a little bit too much. You're like, well, Google Maps said I could turn left there, when it clearly you can't, It's that kind of idea where it's like, well, the sensor said the soil was dry. So I think we have to find and that can lead to liability issues. We have to find a balance between trusting the technology so that it can help us do our work optimally, efficiently, cost effectively, but that we don't, completely lose all of our natural skill set and expertise that we see from years and years of experience in the field, blindly trusting the technology and thinking that it's going to give us all of the answers. Ultimately, a human being is going to be able to better assess whether or not a tree needs water. That's just the truth. What technology can help us with is target where those areas might be and offer us, when we look at big data and big data analytics, offer us, insight into the patterns that we might not be able to see because we're only focused on one tree. So I think that is a complex and nuanced relationship that we need to figure out as, we are adopting more and more of these technologies. Yeah. So that's one from the management perspective. Number two is, and I talk about this a lot in the last chapter of the book, Raising Future Naturalists, this idea of figuring out, what does children's connection with nature and technology and screen time look like in 2024, and especially grappling with that as a new mom. What does that look like? And I think Richard Louv, who I discussed before of, Last Child in the Woods fame, said it best when I asked him this question directly in our interview, when do you know that that technology is too much? And I think it's something that we intrinsically feel, right? As he said it is, the use of technology is great as long as it's augmenting and adding to the experience. So imagine, you're in the forest and you see, a beautiful new flower you've ever seen before. You take a photo of it on your phone. You might use, a plant ID app to help you identify it. Or you might be using an app like Nature Dose that I discuss in the book, which is like a Fitbit, but for how often you've been in nature that week, which is actually tracking, how much time have you spent out in nature and nudging you to get outside more. That might feel quite dystopian for some people, but I think similar to a Fitbit, a lot of people had a lot of resistance to that. I don't need an app to tell me how many steps to take, but it can actually be a really, really useful tool in nudging us towards those healthy habits. Nature Dose can do the same thing for our exposure to nature. So those, I think, are apps that can work really well because they kind of work in the background, right? They're augmenting, they're adding to those experiences. And I feel as soon as Rich Louv said, as soon as technology is detracting from the natural world, as soon as it gets to the point where we have, kids glued to their screens outdoors, then we might have reached a threshold where that might not be what we're intending to be. And I think a really interesting case study that is right kind of on that fine line is this idea of mobile augmented reality games, which I also talk about in the book. You have, of course, Pokemon Go, which got a lot of fame and notoriety. Also, I think for the bad parts, right? Because you had, kids walking around with their faces glued to their screens, walking into telephone poles. But you're like, oh, but they're outside. And you're like, well, that's not really what we meant. But there's a lot of games that have taken Pokemon Go as inspiration and actually designed, there are two ones I'm thinking of, World Safari, which is based in Denmark, and Agents of Discovery, which is based in the US, which actually use principles of mobile augmented reality, but have them be completely tied to the local biodiversity. So the kid, and I'm not talking about 3 and 4 year olds, right? I'm talking about, 8+ children that already have, some experience with screens. Because I do believe there are certain age limits to when you should introduce a screen at all, but that's a different discussion. That actually use local biodiversity hotspots. So basically, much like they would, with a book, they get an assignment, they put the phone away, they do their scavenger hunt where they have to identify a certain amount of species, they have to collect amount of species, then they use the phone to take pictures of it, they upload that, and then that triggers the next challenge. Again, they put the phone away, they do their next challenge, and I think that's a really beautiful way to offer scalable educational awareness around the natural environment in places that feel safe to do so, that have been vetted by experts, by parents, by educators. So that can be a really beautiful way to have technology be an aid. But again, I think as an adult, as an educator, as a parent, I think quite quickly when is the technology helping and when is it hurting.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, I think there's something I've seen lately, and I'm not by any means the first person to have this realization, is the sort of risks around AI sort of percolating through society and the things that we do. And, having spoken to, and I hate to be the 30-year-old who's now begrudgingly talking about Gen Z, but, people who are doing their undergrads in the era of AI and are saying like, I just get ChatGPT to write my essays for me, and then I double check them and stuff before submitting. And I think, if we get too reliant on the easy way out of getting AI and getting the sort of technological solutions to sort of shortcut us to places, 20 years down the line we may have just lost the expertise to go out and assess a tree with our senses and with our knowledge.
Yeah.
And I do feel like that's like a slippery slope of getting far too reliant on these things. So yeah, I really appreciate
it is
what you say about the technology being an addition and an augment to, I guess, our practices that we already have, that really should start with the human being taking the front seat and then getting some assistance to maybe fill in our gaps, make things more scalable. There's not that enough urban foresters really to do this, so that can help just to make these things happen with limited resources. Hopefully we can keep it in that spirit and not let it sort of get away from us.
It's interesting you say that, because I think that's really how I see, especially from a management perspective, these technologies playing a role in basically expanding the workforce in a cost-effective way. But at the same time, making sure that then, okay, we've expanded the workforce, we've been able to outsource, if you will, all of these, tasks that we need to do on a daily basis, like, for example, watering trees. Okay, we've been able to outsource that. That means that we've freed up time somewhere else. And can we then use that time to attract and engage and inspire and educate the next generation of urban forests and arboriculturalists? Because urban foresters and arboriculturalists, the first thing they will say is that they are really, really struggling with an enormous labor shortage, and it's really difficult to get the next generation of people, of young ones, excited about this field. And it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because I think on the one hand, this kind of use of technology can be a way to actually attract that generation, right? Like this is a very modern approach to urban forestry, something that might attract them. These digital natives that have worked with these tools their entire lives. So that's, I think, exciting. On the other hand, and I think that's where good parenting and good mentorship and good apprenticeship comes into play, being very, very clear that technology is just one tool in your toolbox, and it is absolutely not a holy grail and something that you can, rely on for everything that's always going to give you answers. Because, sensors out of batteries, now what?
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you, Nadina. I think we're sort of coming up to the end of our time here. Is there any, closing thoughts you want to share with people? I'm sure there's like architects, planners, ecologists, all sorts of people listening. Is there anything you just sort of like to leave them with, maybe to think about or to start integrating into their work?
I think for the green professionals amongst the listeners, I think it would be really interesting to ask you to consider what your day-to-day tasks look like in your field and what kind of technologies might be able to fit into that to help to optimize those workflows and do your work more efficiently so that you do have more time for that education perspective. Because every urban forestry arboriculturist that I spoke to, when I ask them, what is your favorite part of your job, is talking to the public, educating kids, speaking to people about the benefits and their love for trees. That's why they got into the work in the first place. That's what really, really fires them up. So I would love to see a world where they're able to dedicate more time to that, because I think that's going to do more for public awareness about the importance of nature in our cities than anything else. And I would say for the general, green city, folks that are maybe interested in this but not necessarily working in it professionally, is I would encourage you to take stock of the nature around you. We know from research that the nature within a 500-meter radius of your home, that's going to be the nature that directly impacts your health and well-being on a daily basis. But so we don't even really think about it in that sense. We need to start thinking about nature as the public health tool that it is, as something that we need to interact with on a daily basis to get all these benefits out of it. And I really feel that if we don't use it, we lose it. So the more people that take stock of what's around them, the more that we can do to preserve those spaces and hopefully invite other people to enjoy those spaces as well.